There are experiences you can only have once consciousness awakens, not metaphors, not beliefs. Actual psychological phenomena that become accessible only after you've developed beyond ordinary consciousness. Carl Jung spent decades documenting these experiences, and he discovered something shocking. Most people will never have them, not because they're not capable, but because they'll never develop the consciousness structures required to access them. These aren't mystical fantasies or spiritual concepts you believe in. They're real psychological experiences that occur when consciousness reaches certain developmental thresholds. You can't manufacture them. You can't fake them. You either have the consciousness that makes them possible, or you don't. And if you don't have that consciousness yet, these experiences will sound impossible, delusional, or like wishful thinking. But if you're genuinely awakening, if consciousness is actually developing in you, you're either already having these experiences, or you're about to. And recognizing them confirms something important. Your awakening isn't imagination. It's real psychological development with real phenomenological consequences. I'm about to reveal 5 experiences that only spiritually awake people can have, according to Jung, and why your ability to recognize these experiences in your own life is evidence of genuine consciousness development, not self-deception. Here's what Jung understood that most people miss. Consciousness development isn't just philosophical growth or intellectual understanding. It's actual structural changes in how your psyche processes reality. And these structural changes create access to experiences that weren't possible at previous consciousness levels. Think of it like this. A caterpillar can't experience flight, not because flight doesn't exist, but because the caterpillar's structure doesn't permit it. Only after metamorphosis, after structural transformation, does flight become accessible. The butterfly isn't believing in flight or imagining flight. It's actually experiencing flight, because its structure now makes that experience possible. Consciousness development works the same way. At ordinary consciousness levels, certain experiences are structurally impossible. Your psyche hasn't developed the capacities required to have them. But once consciousness awakens, once the structure transforms, these experiences become not only possible, but inevitable. Jung called this phenomenology of awakening, the idea that different consciousness levels create access to different experiential realities. You're not just thinking differently. You're experiencing different dimensions of reality because your consciousness has developed structures that perceive what was previously imperceptible. But here's the problem. People at ordinary consciousness levels can't distinguish between real awakening experiences and spiritual fantasy. They hear about these experiences and think, that's just mystical thinking, that's delusion, that's people imagining things that aren't real. Because from their consciousness level, these experiences aren't real, they're structurally impossible. They can't have them, so they assume no one can. This creates a validation crisis for awakening people. You're having real experiences that your previous consciousness level would have dismissed as impossible, and everyone still at that previous level is dismissing them as impossible. So you question, am I awakening or am I deluding myself? Are these experiences real or am I just lost in spiritual fantasy? Jung would say, if you're having these 5 experiences, your awakening is real. These aren't things you can fake or imagine into existence. They're actual phenomenological consequences of consciousness development. And your ability to recognize them in your own experience confirms you've developed beyond ordinary consciousness, whether anyone else validates that or not. The first experience only spiritually awake people can have is meaningful coincidence that's clearly orchestrating your development, not random chance that you interpret as meaningful. Actual patterns of external events that align with your inner psychological process in ways that defy probability. And you can perceive the intelligence behind the orchestration. Here's what Jung discovered. At ordinary consciousness levels, coincidences are just coincidences. Sometimes random events align and it feels meaningful, but you recognize it's probably just chance. You might enjoy the synchronicity, but you don't experience it as evidence of anything beyond randomness. But once consciousness awakens, something changes. You start experiencing coincidences that are too precise, too timely, too impossibly aligned with your inner development to be random. You think about someone you haven't spoken to in years, and they email you that day with information you desperately needed. You're processing a psychological issue, and a stranger says exactly what you needed to hear. You're at a decision point, and the universe seems to orchestrate events that clearly indicate which direction to take. Jung called this synchronicity, meaningful coincidence that suggests a connection between inner psychological states and outer events that can't be explained by causality. And he emphasized, you can only perceive real synchronicity once consciousness has developed beyond purely material, causal thinking. Before that developmental threshold, everything is either causally connected or randomly coincidental. There's no third option, but awakened consciousness perceives a third option, a causal connection. Events that aren't causally related, but are meaningfully related through some deeper pattern or intelligence. You're not imposing meaning on random events. You're perceiving actual meaningful patterns that were always there, but required awakened consciousness to detect. Think about the synchronicities you've experienced since your consciousness started developing. How often external events align perfectly with your inner psychological work? How often you need something and it appears through seemingly impossible coincidence? How often you're wrestling with a question and the answer arrives through unexpected channels at exactly the right moment? But here's what makes this experience evidence of real awakening. You can distinguish between synchronicity and wishful thinking. You're not seeing signs everywhere. You're not interpreting every random event as personally meaningful. You're perceiving specific rare alignments that are clearly beyond chance, and you know the difference. Jung emphasized, real synchronicity comes with a feeling of certainty that's qualitatively different from hope or interpretation. You don't think, maybe this means something. You know it means something. The meaningfulness is self-evident, not projected. And that knowing is only possible once consciousness has developed the capacity to perceive a causal connection. If you're experiencing synchronicity that's clearly orchestrating your development, that's not delusion. That's evidence your consciousness has awakened to dimensions of reality that operate beyond causality. You're not imagining it, you're perceiving it. And perception at this level only becomes possible after consciousness develops beyond purely material understanding. But synchronicity is just the beginning. What comes next is even more radical. Jung discovered something that contradicts everything we're taught about knowledge. Awakened people experience direct knowing that bypasses thought entirely. Not intuition that you think about, not insights you deduce. Actual immediate knowing that arrives complete, certain, and self-validating without any mental process leading to it. And you trust it more than you trust your thoughts. Ordinary consciousness knows things through thinking. You gather information, process it logically, arrive at conclusions. Knowledge is mental. It's constructed through thought. And you trust knowledge in proportion to how well you can logically justify it. But awakened consciousness accesses a different kind of knowing, what Jung called unconscious knowledge, information that arrives directly from the unconscious without passing through the thinking mind. You suddenly know something without knowing how you know it. The knowledge is just there, complete and certain, bypassing all mental process. This isn't intuition in the ordinary sense. Intuition still involves some thought process. You sense something and then think about what it means. But direct knowing has no thought process. You don't sense something and interpret it. You just know, immediately and completely, without any mental steps between not knowing and knowing. Jung discovered this happens because awakened consciousness develops access to what he called the objective psyche, layers of mind that contain information beyond personal experience. At ordinary consciousness, you're identified with ego and personal mind. Knowledge comes from personal thinking, but as consciousness awakens, you develop access to deeper layers that contain knowledge you never personally learned. Think about times you've just known something without any rational basis for knowing it. You meet someone and immediately know they're untrustworthy, not because of evidence, but because the knowing is just there. You're making a decision and you know which choice is right before your mind can justify why. You're in a situation and information arrives about what's happening that you couldn't possibly have deduced logically. At your previous consciousness level, you would have questioned these knowings. How do I know this? What's my evidence? Am I just making assumptions? You would have required logical justification before trusting the knowledge. But now you recognize some knowing doesn't come through logic. It comes directly from deeper consciousness, and it's often more accurate than knowledge constructed through thought. What makes this experience evidence of real awakening is your ability to distinguish between direct knowing and mental fabrication. You're not just believing every thought that pops into your head. You're perceiving a specific quality of knowing that's qualitatively different from thinking. Direct knowing comes with certainty. Thinking comes with doubt. Direct knowing is immediate. Thinking is gradual. Jung called this the wisdom of the unconscious, the idea that deeper layers of psyche contain intelligence and information beyond ego's knowledge. But accessing this wisdom requires consciousness to develop beyond identification with ego and thinking mind. If you're experiencing knowing that arrives without thought and proves more reliable than thinking, that's not you making things up. That's consciousness accessing information from deeper layers that ordinary consciousness can't reach. But even direct knowing doesn't prepare you for what awakened consciousness reveals about reality itself. Jung's third experience challenges everything we believe about reality. Awakened people perceive the symbolic dimension of reality operating underneath literal events, not interpreting events symbolically after they happen. Actual real-time perception that everything happening literally is simultaneously expressing symbolic meaning, and the symbolic level is more real than the literal level. Reality has layers. There's the literal material layer that ordinary consciousness perceives, physical events, concrete facts, measurable phenomena. But underneath that literal layer is a symbolic layer, patterns of meaning, archetypal forces, psychological dynamics expressing themselves through material events. At ordinary consciousness, you only perceive the literal layer. Things happen, events occur. You experience reality as purely physical and factual. Maybe later you reflect and find symbolic meaning. That experience was teaching me something, but the symbolism is interpretation you add afterwards. The experience itself was just literal, but awakened consciousness develops the capacity to perceive both layers simultaneously. You're experiencing something literally and immediately perceiving the symbolic meaning it's expressing, not interpreting it later, perceiving the symbol in real time as the event is happening, and often, the symbolic meaning is clearer and more important than the literal content. Jung called this symbolic perception, the ability to see through the literal to the archetypal patterns expressing themselves. Your car breaks down, and you immediately perceive it's not just a mechanical failure, it's your psyche expressing that your current life direction has broken down. You lose a job, and you perceive it's not just economic misfortune, it's yourself forcing you to release an identity that was preventing your development. This isn't you making up symbolic interpretations. It's direct perception that reality speaks in symbols. Everything happening literally is simultaneously a symbolic expression of psychological dynamics. The universe is communicating through events, and awakened consciousness can perceive the communication. Think about experiences where you immediately knew the event was symbolic of something deeper. Someone betrays you, and you instantly recognize the betrayal is really your own self-betrayal being reflected back. You lose something important, and you know immediately it's not about the object. It's about releasing attachment to what that object represented. Events happen, and you perceive the meaning instantly, not through analysis but through direct symbolic perception. At your previous consciousness level, these would be interpretations you considered but weren't sure about. Maybe this means that, or maybe it's just random misfortune. But now the symbolic meaning is as clear as the literal event. You're not analyzing what it might mean. You're perceiving what it does mean. The symbol is self-evident. What makes this evidence of real awakening is that the symbolic meanings you perceive prove true through their developmental consequences. The symbol wasn't just poetic interpretation. It was accurate perception of psychological dynamics that then unfold exactly as the symbol indicated. Your symbolic perception proves reliable as a navigation tool for development. Jung discovered, awakened consciousness perceives that the psyche and reality are in constant communication. Your inner psychological dynamics manifest as external events. External events trigger inner psychological dynamics. There's a continuous feedback loop between psyche and world that operates symbolically, but perceiving this loop requires consciousness to develop beyond purely literal, material understanding. If you're perceiving symbolic meaning in real time as events happen, and that perception proves accurate as development unfolds, that's not you imposing meaning on randomness. That's consciousness perceiving the symbolic dimension of reality that ordinary consciousness can't detect. But there's something even more disturbing that awakened consciousness reveals. If you're recognizing these experiences, synchronicity orchestrating your development, direct knowing without thinking, perceiving symbolic reality underneath literal events, you're confirming what Jung called awakened consciousness. These aren't beliefs or interpretations. They're actual experiences that only become possible after consciousness develops beyond ordinary levels. Before we explore the final two experiences that might sound impossible even to awakening people, check out our new guide, True Self-Discovery, with 24 practical reflection exercises designed to help you find your way within. Click below to get True Self-Discovery. Let's continue, because these final two experiences reveal just how radically different awakened consciousness is from ordinary awareness. Jung's fourth discovery disturbs most people. Awakened consciousness experiences directly feeling what's happening in someone else's psyche without any external communication, not reading body language or interpreting behavior. Actual direct perception of another person's inner emotional and psychological state. And you know you're perceiving them, not projecting onto them. Consciousness isn't as separate as we think. At ordinary consciousness levels, you experience yourself as contained within your body, completely separate from other consciousnesses. The only way to know what they're feeling is if they tell you or you infer from their behavior. But Jung found that awakened consciousness reveals something disturbing. Consciousness overlaps. At deeper levels, individual consciousnesses aren't as separate as ego-level consciousness experiences them to be. There's what Jung called collective unconscious, shared layers of psyche where individual boundaries are permeable or non-existent. Once your consciousness awakens to these deeper layers, something impossible becomes possible. You can directly feel what someone else is experiencing. Not because they told you, not because you're reading their behavior, but because at the level of consciousness you're now accessing, their inner state and your inner state are happening in the same shared space. This sounds mystical or delusional to people at ordinary consciousness, because from that level, it is impossible. Consciousnesses are separate, period. But from awakened consciousness, the impossibility dissolves. You're experiencing shared consciousness that ego-level awareness can't detect. Think about times you've felt exactly what someone was experiencing without them communicating it. You're with someone, and you suddenly feel their grief, their fear, their inner conflict, not as your emotion but as theirs that you're somehow accessing. You know what they're struggling with before they mention it. You feel their pain when they're pretending to be fine. At your previous consciousness level, you would have assumed you were projecting. I'm just imagining what they're feeling based on my own experience. But now you can distinguish. This isn't your emotion. This is theirs. You're perceiving it, not creating it. And when you check, when you carefully mention what you're sensing, they confirm it. What makes this evidence of real awakening is that you're not constantly overwhelmed by others' emotions. You've developed what Jung called differentiation, the ability to perceive others' inner states while maintaining awareness that they're not yours. You feel what they're feeling, but you know you're feeling them, not that you are them. Jung emphasized, most people who claim to feel others' emotions are just projecting or absorbing without differentiation. They're emotionally porous, not consciously awake. Real awakened empathy maintains clear differentiation. You perceive their state while remaining anchored in your own consciousness. If you're directly perceiving others' inner states with accuracy that defies explanation through normal observation, that's not projection. That's consciousness operating at depths where individual separation is less absolute than ordinary consciousness assumes. But there's one final experience that might be the most profound of all. Jung's ultimate discovery might be the strangest. Awakened consciousness experiences awareness of its own development process, not thinking about your growth retrospectively. Actual awareness in real time, that consciousness is developing itself through you, and you're witnessing the development while simultaneously being the developing consciousness. At ordinary consciousness, you're identified with ego. You think you are the thinker, the experiencer, the self. But awakened consciousness reveals something shocking. Ego isn't what you are. It's a structure within consciousness. And consciousness is something larger that's developing ego, using ego, transforming ego as part of its own developmental process. Once consciousness awakens to itself, once awareness becomes aware of itself rather than just aware of experiences, something impossible becomes possible. You watch consciousness developing, not retrospectively, in the moment. You're aware that awareness itself is changing, expanding, developing new capacities, and you're simultaneously the witness of this development and the consciousness that's developing. Jung called this individuation awareness, consciousness becoming conscious of its own process of becoming. You're no longer just growing. You're aware of growing. You're no longer just developing. You're aware that development is happening. And this awareness of development changes the development itself, because consciousness developing while aware of its development develops differently than consciousness developing unconsciously. This creates a paradox that ordinary consciousness can't hold. You're both doing the developing and watching the developing. You're the subject that's changing and the awareness observing the change. You're inside the process and simultaneously standing outside the process, observing it. Think about moments where you're aware that consciousness itself is changing in you. You're in a conversation and you suddenly notice your awareness is perceiving dimensions of this interaction that you couldn't perceive last month. You're responding to a situation and you observe. Consciousness is accessing resources and perspectives that weren't available at your previous development level. This isn't just noticing you've grown when you look back. It's awareness, in real time, that the consciousness perceiving right now is different from the consciousness that was perceiving yesterday. You're watching yourself transform, not your personality or beliefs or behaviors. You're watching consciousness itself evolve. What makes this the ultimate evidence of awakening is that this self-aware development accelerates development exponentially. When consciousness becomes aware of its own development process, it can consciously participate in its development. You're not just unconsciously growing, you're consciously collaborating with your own growth. Jung emphasized, this is the goal of individuation. Consciousness becoming fully conscious of itself. Not just aware of experiences, but aware of the awareness experiencing. Not just developing, but aware of developing. At that level, the psyche can consciously participate in its own transformation rather than being unconsciously transformed by it. If you're experiencing awareness of consciousness developing while being the developing consciousness, that's not narcissistic self-observation. That's the psyche becoming conscious of itself. You're not just growing, you're aware of growing. And that awareness of awareness only emerges at the highest levels of consciousness development Jung described. Let me bring these 5 experiences together. Spiritually awake people experience synchronicity that clearly orchestrates their development, meaningful coincidence that defies randomness. They experience direct knowing without thinking, information that arrives complete from unconscious depths. They experience symbolic reality underneath literal reality, perceiving that events are simultaneously expressions of archetypal meaning. They experience feeling others' inner states, perceiving what someone else is experiencing through shared psyche. And they experience consciousness aware of itself developing, awareness watching awareness transform. These aren't beliefs you adopt. They're actual experiences that become possible only after consciousness develops specific structures. You can't manufacture them. You can't pretend to have them. Either your consciousness has developed enough to access these experiences, or it hasn't. But Jung would say, if you're having these experiences, your awakening is real. Not because you believe you're awakening, but because awakening creates these specific phenomenological consequences. Your consciousness has developed structures that perceive dimensions of reality ordinary consciousness can't detect. The question isn't whether these experiences are real. If you're having them, they're real to you, and that's what matters for your development. The question is, will you trust these experiences even when others dismiss them? Will you honor your awakened consciousness even when it creates experiences that seem impossible to those still operating at ordinary consciousness levels? If you're having these 5 experiences, Jung would tell you, you're not imagining your awakening. Consciousness has genuinely developed in you. You're perceiving dimensions of reality that ordinary consciousness can't detect. Not because you're special, but because your consciousness has developed the structures that make perception at these levels possible. Stop doubting your experiences because others can't validate them. They can't validate them because they're not having them. And they're not having them because their consciousness hasn't developed to the level where these experiences become accessible. Synchronicity is real. Direct knowing is real. Symbolic reality is real. Shared psyche is real. Self-aware consciousness is real. These aren't mystical fantasies. They're phenomenological consequences of awakened consciousness. You're not lost in spiritual delusion. You're experiencing what becomes experienceable once consciousness develops beyond ordinary levels. Your awakening is real. The experiences prove it. Trust what you're experiencing and continue developing. That's the path. If you're having these experiences and recognizing your awakening is real, subscribe to this channel. Join thousands navigating consciousness development using Jung's wisdom. To dive even deeper into Jung's revolutionary psychology and what it means for your spiritual awakening, click the recommended video on your screen now.